everyone could see Darren's shirt on the Zoom. It says "Forced Family Fun." And that's kind of like, yeah, we're there, the whole gang, Eddie, Patty, everybody's got it. That's kind of the theme of the meditation, right? Because I've had this line in my head since I went to visit a good friend of mine in October down in the hill country in Texas, and we've been friends since we were 11, 12, and she said, "Why is it so hard to love even those we love?" And that has just been stuck in my head. Why is it so hard to love even those we love? And her and her husband had just built their dream home down in the hill country after 40 years of public service, and they have had a really rough year, a much rougher year than they expected. But listening to her, I thought, it hasn't always been that hard to love. I remember when we were in college at Texas A&M in 1981, and she met Robin, the love of her life. He was in the band at Texas A&M and the Corps, and he was wearing this pink sundress. It was 1981. I picked her up. We were going to zip back to Arlington for the weekend, and she jumped in the car, and she was just breathless. She just knew this tall, skinny guy with the biggest ears I'd ever seen was her guy. And here we were, 43 years later, sitting there under the big Texas sky, really dark, before the dawn when the lights come up. And they were talking about the year they had on the heels of a really rough decade. But just this year, they'd lost her mother. Her brother's mental illness had gotten worse. Their daughter was in the midst of a really messy divorce, and their 5- and 7-year-old sons were just really heartsick. And then the roughest part was they've had an estrangement with their son and his wife and the little kids, and it was just such a tender moment. And they're not the only ones, right? I mean, as a pastor, you kind of have a front row seat into people's lives. And it seems like lately with the addiction and anxiety and social media and social isolation and social all of it, folks are struggling. And then with the election, which has driven a wedge in some households, and just kind of thinking, how is it that it can be hard to love the ones we love, the ones who are so dear to us, the ones who we spend our life with? And so it's also tricky to love those we don't know as well. And think about the offering we take tonight. Half of it goes to people who live on the streets. Many of us spend a good bit of the month trying to serve folks, volunteering, Cherith Brook, Micah. And I'm embarrassed to say that I also spend a good bit of my time lately trying to get Pete off of my street. If you live near the Art Institute or the Art Museum, you might know Pete. He kind of lives not so much just on the street, but I mean like in the middle of the street. He's schizophrenic, and he builds these really elaborate structures, some of them 2 and 3 stories high, and he's talking to himself and he's shouting at everybody. And if I could show you the emails and text and phone calls that we've had back and forth with the homeless coordinator, and I always start off, I care about this. How is it so hard to love even the people we know we're called to love, right? And it's the same with Gaza. This really difficult, tough situation. When the war broke out a little over a year ago, I brought these peace dove, these lamps that I had gotten in the West Bank in Gaza, maybe in West Bank in a little village called Tabay. It's one of the oldest Palestinian Christian villages, supposedly a place where Jesus spent the night. And if you've ever been in a place like that, everyone's trying to sell you, here's some bristles from a brush that Jesus used, and here's some, leftover, this and that, all in this. And then after a while we were there, and you realized what they were really trying to sell us there was peace. They were this little village that had a choir of Jewish and Christian and Muslim children, and they had started a health clinic because the checkpoints in their village were so difficult that people were literally dying trying to get health care, women trying to get to maternity centers. And the priest of the village had started this project 20-something years ago where he wanted to get one of these little peace doves in every single congregation, every community around the world. He believed that if every little community had a little candle like this lit to the heavens, that one day there would be peace in the Holy Land. So when the war broke out, I brought these up from my basement, some of you may remember, and I decided we would each take a turn keeping this light lit, right, until the war was over. And somebody took it for a week and then brought it, and somebody else for another week. And this went on for like 7 or 8 weeks until I just gave up. Who would imagine 14, 15 months later, just the rubble of the place. Sometimes it is so hard to love even when we want to love. And that's not anything new. The whole gospel lesson, the whole gospel story, we've been going through this during Advent. Jesus' story, it begins in war, begins in Roman occupation, it begins in empire. It's Tiberius and Pilate and Herod and Assad and Putin, and name whatever dictator you want. People whose bodies and souls are crushed by empire. And then, as if that's not enough, well, it turns out dysfunctional families are not a new thing, right? So we're told kind of the little snippets that we can pull together about this holy family. What's come down to us in tradition is that you've got Joseph, who's kind of an older dad, and you've got Mary, who's kind of a younger mom, and you've got what you call an arranged marriage, which is what you still have in the Middle East, right? Where people aren't together without a chaperone really until the wedding night. But somehow, as the story goes, Mary is found to be with child. And in those days, she could be stoned to death. We're told, though, Joseph is a righteous man. He decides to put her away until the angel comes and says, hello, don't even worry about it. This is God's child. And supposedly Joseph says, okay, that sounds good. And Joseph shows this kind of love that's not the kind of syrupy sweet love, but what we call agape, right? That kind of love that's patient, kind, that's not jealous or boastful, rude, the kind of love that believes all things. That says, as long as you can believe hate, I can believe love. As long as you can believe war will go on forever and ever and ever and ever, I can say right up there around the corner is peace, right? As long as you can say only this group of people are welcome, I can say look at the variety and beauty in which God's people come. And so in this kind of story, the people told not just a story of terror and empire, they also told a story of love just flooding into the world. And the way they knew to tell that story was about this God who comes to us in this tiny baby and takes on flesh. And I've been thinking all the ways about how I see love just flooding into the world. I think about that day in October, that early morning, sitting there under the Texas sky with my friends from decades, talking about the tough year. Robin said something about Cindy's cancer, how happy he was she had made it through. And he had reached out his hand for her hand. And it was like one of those moments where it was so beautiful, you just had to look away. It reminded me of like that Michelangelo Sistine Chapel where you see God's hand reaching out, and thinking of all the ways our hands reach out. I was thinking about our own community this year, about our dear Ed, 80-something, how he would go see Charlene every single day, touching her until she breathed her last. How our younger Judy lost her husband, 63, going to see him so faithfully. How Jimmy and Jaminda and Isaac cared for Micah, 19, holding him, caring for him, loving him until he breathed his last. All the small ways we flood each other's lives with love. All the parents who get up and make the lunches and make more lunches and get the kids to school. All the ways we reach out to neighbors. All the ways we gather, our extra socks and clothes and do what we can. All the ways we march for justice and insist on rights to be the people who make decisions about our own lives and the people who welcome everyone. And I thought about Nedra and Sheila in our church, what they've offered this world, even in a very difficult year. Nedra is one of our main volunteers at Micah. When she quit working as a teacher at William Chrisman after decades, she started volunteering almost full time to make sure that people who go to the homeless shelter have clothing. And 3 months ago, she lost her mother. And a year ago tonight, Nedra's wife, Sheila, they lost their 22-year-old niece, who was killed in just a tragic accident in Jacksonville, Florida, when, the car she was in was hit by another driver and her husband of just 2 months, and the whole family was all there and witnessed it. And in this last year, Sheila and Nedra have continued to just flood the world with love. Sheila has gotten up every day, gone to William Chrisman, continued her life there as a debate coach, right? Just flooding the world with love. That's what this night is really about. It's an invitation for us to just bring our simple gifts, to wrap cards for one another and wrap gifts for one another and make candy for one another, just as a way of reminding that just as God has come into our lives, we are invited to come into one another's. So our prayer this evening is that this simple night might be something that pushes you along to love in fresh new ways, and to be reminded as ever of the way God envelops and embraces you with love. With that hope, let us receive our offering.